On this Saturday night, breaking news, a Halloween stampede in Seoul. Dozens killed and a crowd crushed during weekend festivities. Human chain for Iran. The Canada-wide protest and the regime's toughest warning yet. The bitterly fought Brazilian election and the fate of the Amazon rainforest. And Master of Disguise, a former spy's new mission, bringing people out of hiding.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening to you. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to begin tonight with the breaking news out of South Korea, where we know at least 146 people are dead and another 150 are injured after being trapped and crushed in an apparent crowd surge during Halloween celebrations in Seoul. Local media reports there were as many as 100,000 people in the narrow streets of the city's entertainment district for Saturday night Halloween festivities. Witnesses say people were jammed together and that they couldn't breathe, and they were crushed after the crowd began pushing forward in an alley. Dozens of bodies were placed on the streets under blue sheets before being taken to a nearby gym to be identified. Many of the victims were in their 20s. More than 800 emergency responders have been deployed from across the country, and the death toll is sadly expected to rise as many of the injured are currently in critical condition. Thousands of Canadians lined up in cities across our country, joining a global human chain protest to support the people of Iran. A brutal crackdown on widespread protests continues within the country, with the Revolutionary Guard stepping up warnings to what it calls rioters. Here today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau led the protest in Ottawa and had harsh words for Iran's Islamic regime. Dan Spector reports.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau joins hundreds of protesters in Ottawa, many of them Iranian Canadians, as they deliver a clear message. They gathered to loudly denounce the Iranian regime and offer support to demonstrators who have been risking their lives to take to the streets of Iran for over 40 days now, galvanized by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who died in the custody of the so-called morality police after being arrested for not wearing her hijab correctly. At least 270 people have been killed and 14,000 arrested, according to human rights activists.
This is a revolution.
25-year-old Niayesh Zaifi left Iran in 2019 to study in Canada. She said back in her home country, she had been arrested 3 times just for the way she was dressed.
It's not normal, but yeah, we've all been through it, and it's very dehumanizing and derogatory.
Many in Ottawa holding signs displaying the names and photos of demonstrators killed by authorities in recent weeks. This woman tied up to symbolize the oppression in Iran.
I'm doing this makeup to show that we're not gonna shut up, and my people are gonna fight to get their freedom.
Support for the Iranian protesters could be seen from coast to coast. In Vancouver, a human chain marched across the Lions Gate Bridge. In Toronto, thousands lined Yonge Street. Demonstrators also marched in Halifax, all part of a global movement in dozens of cities around the world.
The Iranian people deserve more than just being killed on the streets as if their lives don't matter, but their lives do matter.
The coordinated action came as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard told demonstrators in Iran this would be the last day of protests.
It's not going to be the last day, of course. It's going to be the last day if the government today goes. So that would be the last day of protest.
Enough. Enough of the brutality, enough of the repression.
Crowds in Ottawa cheered as the Prime Minister denounced the regime's human rights abuses and its attack on Flight PS752 in 2020, killing dozens of Canadians.
Those people responsible now will never be forgotten, will never be allowed into Canada.
Trudeau praised the Iranian Canadian community, saying it adds to the vibrancy of Canada. Dan Spector, Global News, Ottawa.
The man charged with attempting to kill U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband appears to have made racist and often rambling posts online, including some that question the results of the 2020 election. The man also has a Canadian connection. He grew up in Powell River, BC, before moving to San Francisco 2 decades ago. Jennifer Johnson reports.
82-year-old Paul Pelosi remains hospitalized after surgery repairing a skull fracture and other injuries.
Has been advised that his name is David and that he is a friend. RP sounded somewhat confused.
Mr. Pelosi managed to call 911, sending officers to their San Francisco home, which was not under guard because the House Speaker was in Washington. Officers witnessed the violent attack. The suspect, 42-year-old David DePape, used a hammer to repeatedly strike Paul Pelosi.
Our officers immediately tackled the suspect, disarmed him, took him into custody.
DePape's stepfather in British Columbia says he hasn't seen him in almost 20 years, but as a child was quiet and never violent. Police say DePape intended to tie Paul Pelosi up and wait for Nancy Pelosi to come home. Since the January 6th riot at the Capitol, threats and attacks have dramatically increased against American elected officials. In the first 3 months of 2022, the U.S. Capitol Police Threat Assessment Team opened over 1,800 cases. Police say DePape was often online, repeating former President Donald Trump's baseless claims the 2020 election was stolen, but also conspiracy theories of Democratic officials running child sex rings.
This was not a random act. This was intentional.
In July, members of Congress were given $10,000 each to upgrade security at their homes. With just over a week till the midterm elections, U.S. President Joe Biden is calling for an end to the threats.
Every person of good conscience needs to clearly and unambiguously stand up against the violence in our politics, regardless of what your politics are.
The House Speaker, who had a weekend booked campaigning for midterm candidates, is now home in San Francisco, her wealthy neighborhood shaken by the attack.
I really don't know what to say because it's just so sad and frustrating.
Capitol Police and the FBI have joined the investigation. House Speaker Pelosi is often the target of credible threats. She is given protective security detail, but her husband is not. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
A new report by the Veterans Ombudsman backs up what veterans have been saying for some time, that they are struggling to access disability benefits. According to the report, vets wait, on average, 43 weeks for decisions regarding their claims. Now, all this is happening as calls grow from employees at Veterans Affairs Canada for the Minister of Veterans Affairs to resign. Our Mercedes Stevenson joins us now with more on this from Ottawa. Mercedes.
Farah, Canadian veterans have put their lives and limbs on the line for this country, and advocates say many are in crisis, facing broken promises and feeling forgotten by the country. The frustration and concerns about neglect aren't coming out of the blue either. Veterans are supposed to wait about 16 weeks on average to have their disability benefits assessed for injuries from their service, like PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. But this week, the Veterans Ombudsman said veterans are waiting on average 43 weeks. That's almost 10 months, and the wait is having an impact.
Veterans are waiting, they're struggling, and they're getting further and further behind, and it's having a greater impact on their mental health.
When a veteran feels like they're a burden on their family.
The situation is getting worse, according to the panel we convened on the West Block this week, and they say not enough is being done to fix it. More veterans have died by suicide than Canadian soldiers were killed in the entirety of the Afghan war. And that statistic was a contributing factor in the feelings of anger and frustration among some veterans when Global News reported that one Canadian veteran was told he could pursue medical assistance in dying as an alternative to treatment by a VAC employee. VAC isn't allowed to offer MAID, and the minister and department have both insisted that this is a one-off, but still under investigation when they appeared at committee hearings called into the issue. But the growing disapproval over the minister's performance has led the union that represents VAC employees to call for the minister's resignation this week. And they're not the only ones.
The bar wasn't set very high with his predecessors, and he seems to be not even be able to make that. So I think, with the workers calling for his resignation, I think it's well warranted. And frankly, as a member of his advisory committee, I would suggest the same.
So you think the minister should resign, Bruce?
100%, yes.
This always needs to be a minister who's very capable, very hands-on and action-oriented, and Mr. McCauley is not like that. So he's got to either step up or step out.
We'll have more on veterans in crisis and check in with ER doctors about the staggering wait times in emergency rooms across Canada. Farah?
Thank you, Mercedes. And you can see the full Veterans Panel discussion on the West Block. That's tomorrow right here on Global. Reaction has been pouring in across the country after BC announced an overhaul to its child welfare program in order to give First Nations control over their children. Because despite being a small fraction of the population in British Columbia, Indigenous children make up the majority of kids in foster care. Now, this move is happening as the federal government reckons with compensating families for policies found to be discriminatory. Neetu Garcha takes a deeper look.
BC is poised to become the first province in Canada to legally recognize the right of Indigenous communities to provide their own child welfare systems.
Our children have an inherent right to know who they are, where they come from, what they belong to.
The current legislation in the province does not allow the BC government to hand over cases of children entering or already in care to an Indigenous government. The proposed amendments include new information sharing and consent agreements, bringing BC in line with similar federal legislation, Bill C-92, which came into force in 2020.
This day heralds the achievement of the goals pursued for many years by successive chiefs and councils.
The news has been acclaimed by advocates as a positive step forward, with the hope other provinces will follow suit.
In December, we're going to the Supreme Court because Quebec challenged C-92, or the ability for us to have our own laws and jurisdiction. So throughout the country, there's definitely, there's from one extreme to the other.
Advocate Mary Teegee has also been involved in negotiations at the heart of a second major announcement this week. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rejecting Ottawa's offer to compensate Indigenous children and families harmed by the discriminatory on-reserve system.
They rejected it because many of the victims that would be otherwise entitled to compensation were going to be left out. And that just did not sit well with us.
Teegee says the $20 billion cap for compensation, a key part of the larger $40 billion deal, described as historic by the feds, would leave out an estimated 15,000 victims covered by the landmark ruling, and points to a solution.
Tribunal states is that what they are saying is that $20 billion that's already earmarked for compensation be placed in a trust, and that interest from that $20 billion would be utilized to compensate other victims.
But that would hinge on having all sides agree. The Assembly of First Nations lead negotiator called the rejection deeply frustrating and sad. Ashley Bach, who says she was taken from her family shortly after birth, is worried for all those who expected to receive compensation early in the new year.
I want them to say that to the youth from Nan Territory who tried to kill herself on the side of the road in my hands because she aged out and was homeless and had no money. And honestly, to me, it sounded like she didn't have any hope for the future, which are things that the compensation will help to alleviate.
Bach says no funding amount will ever be perfect and delays are unacceptable.
And suddenly, these other concerns are being pulled out of nowhere in order to delay it.
A plea highlighting the urgency behind these fundamental changes aimed at helping to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care, often on the brink of poverty when they age out of it. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Burnaby, BC.
Coming up, it's the final push for two populist heavyweights ahead of Brazil's election tomorrow. Why Brazilian democracy and the fate of the Amazon rainforest are both on the ballot. One of the biggest democracies in the world picks a new president tomorrow. Brazilians will cast their ballots in a runoff election that at this point is too close to call, according to experts. And it has been a very bitter campaign, including a testy final debate. But as Mike Armstrong explains, the election is not just about which populist candidate is going to be president, but the future of the planet, with the Amazon rainforest at stake.
There has been nothing out of bounds in this campaign. From the incumbent side, Jair Bolsonaro, there have been accusations his opponent is supported by Satanists. And from the challenger's campaign, Lula, there have been accusations Bolsonaro considered cannibalism to get votes. With the runoff campaign wrapping up, polls put Lula in the lead, but barely.
Imprevisível.
Political scientist Carlos Pereira calls the election entirely unpredictable. He says Lula's ahead, but that it's impossible to say who'll win. What makes this one so hard to call may have a lot to do with Bolsonaro's pitch to voters. He's borrowed from the Donald Trump populism playbook. Bolsonaro pushes distrust in state institutions, everything from the courts to the Board of Elections. Pollsters have trouble pegging his support because his supporters distrust pollsters. In the first round vote earlier this month, Bolsonaro finished in second with 42.2%. That was higher than expected and came despite mismanagement of the pandemic. The country had close to 700,000 deaths and growing poverty. There is a feeling among people their lives are economically worse off, he says, and we recognize that. Now, the frontrunner is a former president. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva is known as Lula and ran the country from 2003 to 2010. When he left power, he had an approval rating close to 90%. But his reputation took a hit when his hand-picked successor ended up in a recession and a corruption scandal erupted. Lula himself was arrested and spent more than 500 days in jail over a bribery conviction that was eventually overturned. In a country where so many already distrust politicians, Lula's past scandals are seen by many as just the sort of thing they all do. Brazil's economy grew under Lula, and he's pitching himself as the person to do it again. He calls himself the candidate with the experience to rebuild the country. There are important issues that divide the two candidates. Bolsonaro loosened gun control laws in recent years. Lula's talked about tightening them. And they differ on climate change as well. Lula has promised to fight deforestation in the Amazon, something that has surged under Bolsonaro. He says enough of it's protected already. Well, the future of the world's largest rainforest is on the ballot Sunday. It just may not be a top concern in a country where poverty is a growing problem. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
Coming up, how the color of your skin impacts the quality of healthcare in Canada. Getting proper, timely healthcare in Canada is tough enough. But if you're Black, there is another complication to be considered: systemic bias and racism that's been plaguing the system for decades. In hopes of sparking change and addressing the role it plays, this week, Canada's foremost medical journal released the first edition of its two-part anti-Black racism series, a compilation of articles and research by Black authors. As Jamie Morocco reports, experts say it's a small step toward more equitable care.
When breast cancer patient Michelle Audouin made the decision to have a double mastectomy, she expressed some concerns specific to the color of her skin. No doctor, she says, could answer her questions.
I really felt like my issues didn't matter, and I didn't feel confident in making a decision about a life-changing surgery because I didn't see myself represented.
Stories like Audouin's play out every day in Canada's healthcare system. Part of the problem, experts say, is a lack of education and understanding due to minimal research and data published by Black educators and clinicians. And in Canada, the impacts become even more difficult to measure because registries don't routinely collect race data, despite this being the norm in the US and UK.
It becomes unsafe healthcare that we are more likely to experience compared to our white counterparts.
In 2020, Dr. Oni Noram and Dr. Omi Sheree Dryden asked the prominent Canadian Medical Association Journal to set aside space to dive into the issues BIPOC patients face unique to Canadian healthcare.
The stereotypes lead to exacerbating our overall healthcare, lead to a delay in seeking health interventions, and can lead to earlier death and poorer outcomes.
2 years later, the first articles show Black patients face more barriers when accessing primary care physicians and screening programs, and reveal mortality from certain cancers are higher in Black patients than white.
The numbers don't tell you everything. You have to actually have the numbers and care enough about those folks to mobilize resources or to have public accountability for change.
Audouin, who was initially told she had early-stage breast cancer, pushed for more tests, only to be re-diagnosed with stage 4. Now she advocates for equity for other cancer patients.
It has to move beyond symbolic posturing or performative measures. It has to be systemic change.
Change that could mean the difference between life and death. Jamie Morocco, Global News.
Next, undercover mission, how a former CIA agent is helping people face the world again. There is a hidden world of people who live with physical disfigurements. Could be a result of a genetic abnormality or maybe a traumatic event. And for these people, just going outside the house can be daunting. But one man has made it his mission to help them pass through life unnoticed. This week, for the new reality, Jackson Prosco introduces us to a former spy with a remarkable talent. Jackson.
Inside this pretty unassuming office complex in Virginia, something remarkable is happening. It's where ultra-realistic works of art take shape that have the power to change human lives. Robert Barron is a former CIA disguise expert who turned his talent for making incredible disguises into a skill that has helped hundreds of people. He makes prosthetics for people who have been disfigured by birth defect or trauma, from noses to full face masks. Perhaps even more remarkable than his work is the story of how he perfected the art of helping people hide in plain sight during his decades spent working at the CIA.
The disguises had to pass the closest scrutiny, like 6 to 12 inches. And if they didn't, then their life would be in jeopardy. They could put it on in 3 seconds.
3 seconds?
And take it off in 3 seconds.
A complete face?
Yes, absolutely.
That sounds like something out of Mission Impossible.
How about Mission Possible?
Today, patients come from around the world for a chance to sit in Robert's chair. We'll take you along through their remarkable journey on the new reality. Back to you.
Thanks, Jackson. You can catch Jackson's full story on Robert Barron on the new reality tonight at 7 right here on Global. And that is Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser. On behalf of our whole team here, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your Saturday evening with us. Tonight's Dear Canada is Rocky Lake in Manitoba. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.